find this one interesting as well. And again, thank you very much for inviting me. So this is joint work with Marco Manacorda, my colleague and long-term co-author at Queen Mary, and Guido Tabellini at Bocconi. And if you like, this is kind of a follow-up of the previous paper on mobile phones and protests. We now look at the effects of 3G and 4G mobile internet, social media in the realm of formal politics in Europe. So when you think of the past decade, probably one of the most salient things that happened from a political standpoint has been the rising support for so-called populist parties that have been characterized by a very strong nationalist and anti-establishment political narrative, especially in Western countries, but I would say worldwide to some extent. And so what we do in this paper is to investigate if mobile phones, third and fourth generation mobile phones, the advent and the associated spread of mobile internet and social media has had an impact on this rise in success for populist parties and to what extent they did contribute to their success. And we argue that a key driver of the success of populist parties has been the concurrent change in voters' political demands for what we call closed as opposed to open societies on policies like immigration and economic integration. And this change in political demand has been part of a wider ideological shift towards a heightened sense of in-group belonging at the expense of out-group members that have been met with increasing contempt and animosity. And what we claim in this paper is that mobile internet and social media have played a key role in fostering this ideological shift, this change in values, and the ensuing realignment in terms of voting that has favored populist parties that are characterized by these features of being more prone to a vision of society that is a closed society as opposed to an open society, as we can document by looking at political party platforms. So towards the end of the talk, I will discuss different narratives and potential explanations as to why mobile internet and social media might trigger this change of ideology and support for populist parties. But let me start by asking why should social media have any impact on this sort of ideological shift? So before doing so, let me say that to present argument in favor of our claim, what we do is to bring to the table very highly granular evidence on the impact of mobile internet on votes and, importantly, on political opinions in the context of Europe, across 22 countries in Europe. And so in particular, what we do is to document the impact of third and fourth generation mobile phones on municipal level voting in national elections. So I will present this very granular municipality level electoral results. Municipalities are the lowest administrative unit available. So there are 30,000 municipalities in France, 8,000 in Italy, and so on and so forth. And what we see is that at the municipal level, those municipalities that received earlier access to mobile internet display an increase in the order of 12 to 23 percentage points increase in the populist vote. So a very substantial effect. We document that this effect is amplified in areas characterized by social and economic disadvantage. So as a catch-all for social exclusion and economic grievances, we use the unemployment rate. And we see that on top of this strong effect of mobile internet, there is an additional 6 to 8 percentage points additional increase in the vote to parties that are defined as populist in areas that are one standard deviation higher unemployment rate. When we turn to the individual level opinions, what we observe is that as mobile internet is rolled out and areas receive access to social media, the voters' ideology shifts to the right, if you like. Individuals start to feel more identified with the local community as opposed to the global society. They display a higher intolerance towards minorities, be it gender-related minorities, race minorities, religious minorities, and they report a heightened sense of nationalism. Again, this especially in areas characterized by high economic disadvantage. So all in all,
can I clarify something?
Sure.
Among the 22 countries you are considering, some of the countries allow voters to vote on internet using mobile phones?
No, that's to these days not an option in Europe.
Okay.
I guess some countries worldwide are moving in that direction, but no, electronic voting is not a thing. As far as I'm aware, in European countries over the period that we observe, which is 2007, 2017.
Thank you.
No. So we take these two pieces of evidence on politics and opinion as documenting that mobile internet has fostered what we called an increase in political tribalism. So it has fostered a rise in a sense of heightened in-group as opposed to out-group, which has translated into greater extremist views along dimensions of in-group protection at the expense of other groups. And these are defining characteristics of the populist parties. So as I was saying before, there are many reasons why one could think that mobile internet has impacted on different angles. But let me start by asking first, how could mobile internet affect ideology, provoke this ideological shift? And so what we do is to build on an influential body of literature in social psychology that shows that emotionally charged content, fake news characterized by sentiment of fear and outrage, and especially content characterized by outgroup animosity, it's much more likely to travel on social media. So these studies document that tweets on the same topic, but one is more emotionally charged, one is more derogatory of the other group, is reshared 20 to 50% more. And this, of course, creates incentives, both from the point of view of the end user. So if I'm tweeting something and I have a metric to see how successful I am, then I want to tweet something that will be reshared. And even more so, from the point of view of the platforms. In the attention economy, platforms are living off attention, capturing the attention and generating engagement on the platform. So this creates a big incentives in producing and sharing this sort of emotionally charged content rather than kind of more dull content. As a result, these studies document that people online are overexposed kind of divisive content, much more than they are offline. And this divisive content is typically addressed towards those who are physically and socially distant because of a lower risk of offline retaliation. So the claim, our reading of the literature, is that in areas where there's greater access to mobile internet, people end up being overexposed to this increased tribalism between those who are the in-groups and those who are the out-groups. And this literature also tells us that this sort of tribalism is enhanced under threats, that individuals feel the in-group as opposed to the out-group when they feel either actual or symbolic threats to their group, and that closed societies emerge in response to such threats. Now, of course, we're not the first to think of identity, of this sense of identity as having a role in politics. There is indeed a recent important contribution by Ben Enkert at Harvard, who distinguishes between what he calls the communitarians and the universalists. And the idea is that people are not different in terms of how much they value the welfare of others in the society. What is different between individuals is the weight that they attach to the welfare of others in the society. So the overall amount of welfare that they want to devote to others in the society is the same, but communitarians place a big emphasis on the welfare of their community, of those who are closer to themselves, their family, their neighbors, their fellow citizens, whereas universalists kind of place an identical weight on the welfare of those who are socially distant from themselves. And so with a little bit of kind of loose terminology, I will be using interchangeably in this presentation, in-group versus out-group, proponents of closed as opposed to open societies, and communitarians as opposed to universalists. Okay? In general, the idea that social identity matters has been studied also more theoretically recently in economics. Studies of social identity have been particularly emphasized the change in political cleavage that matters, so that we moved away from a traditional left-right distinction in terms of redistribution on economic issues to a new distinction between left and right in terms of social conservatism as opposed to social liberalism. And Bonomi, Gennaioli, and Tabellini in particular argue that the economic shocks of the past decade have induced this shift, not so much in terms of who likes or dislikes redistribution and government intervention as much as how relevant it is to, again, be in support of open societies and individual freedom as opposed to social conservative values. In general, there is a large literature you might be aware of on the economic drivers of populism, which is of course related to what we're doing here. So these shocks are as diverse as economic austerity, immigration shocks, the financial crisis, the so-called China shock, so exposure to international competition, automation, and so on. These studies typically look at the reduced form effect of these shocks on some political outcome, rise of populist parties, not necessarily working through this identity channel that we are proposing. The study that is possibly closest to ours is this Guriev, Zuravskaya, and Melnikov in the QJE. They look across several high and middle income countries at the effect of 3G and 4G introduction, so mobile internet, on trust in governments. And they also show some reduced form on political outcomes in Europe at a more aggregate level, claiming that where internet arrives, if you like a typical accountability story, just like with traditional media, internet arrives, it fosters information in the presence of corruption and malfeasance of incumbent politicians. Now, with the internet, more information is spread about these malfeasances, and people vote out the incumbent and try to vote for new parties that haven't engaged in corruption. And so we see our paper as very different because we are highlighting a very different mechanism. It's not moving out from traditional party as much as being attracted from what it's offered in terms of conservative values by these new parties. But I will try to stress more the differences as we go along. So if there are no questions on how we're placed in the literature, then without further ado, I would go to the data. So this is the typical slide that it takes 2 minutes to discuss, but it takes years to build. I mean, so this has been a very painstaking process. So we've collected votes by party for each party in 65 national elections across these 22 countries. So on average, each country has had 3 elections over the period 2007-17 in around 85,000 municipalities of Europe, which cover 92% of the total population of the continent. So now that for each municipality and each election, we have the vote received by each party that is running in the election, then we can do several things. The first thing, in general, what we do is to characterize the political position of each municipality using a weighted average where the weights are the vote shares of each party. So let me clarify this. So first, we use 2 definitions of populism that have been widely used in the literature. So this party, Jourdain, tells me that it's a populist party, this other party is not, and so on and so forth, and the same for Pippa Norris at Harvard. So what we do is to just calculate the vote share received by parties that are classified as populist. But then populism is kind of a very broad concept, and there is a lot of discussion, and it's kind of a loose concept. Some people argue it's a theme-centered ideology. Others say that it's a loose set of ideas. Others yet say that it's just a political rhetoric. It's not really ideas. It's just how you talk about politics. So we try to bring content into this label of populism. And so what we do is to use the expert assessment of each party position and ideology on several matters from the Chapel Hill expert survey. So now these guys tell me that the Democratic Party of Italy is very liberal when it comes to the attitudes towards immigration. And the Northern League is very conservative on this matter. And then similar questions are asked on other dimensions. So how are different parties' attitudes towards EU integration? What's the ideology of each party in terms of left-right? And then kind of unpacking this left-right into left-right on social matters, on individual rights. So the position on social issues, using this index, which is widely used in political science, the GAL-TAN, which is green, alternative, liberal, as opposed to traditional, authoritarian, nationalistic. And it basically relates to individual freedoms, such as euthanasia, abortion, gay rights, minority rights, as opposed to, no, the state should work as a moral guide and individual freedoms should be constrained. Okay, this would be the TAN side of the index. The GAL would be the more liberal. Each party, again, has given a score on this matter as well. And finally, the party position on economic issues. So now I know that in these municipalities, the Democratic Party got 40%, the Northern League got 20%, and so on and so forth. I know the position of these parties on these matters, and I build a weighted average that gives me the position of that municipality on these different matters.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I may have misunderstood this, so if so, apologies. But you look at populism particularly in a right-wing context, not left-wing. Like, for example, Sanders in the US, some people would also call a populist, but you're more interested in the right-wing populism.
Not necessarily. So that's actually a good question I should have clarified. So here we take populist tout court. So these guys just label a party as populist. We also distinguish between left-wing and right-wing populist. As you'll see, all the action in Europe is on the right. But up to this point, it's just the voting share of so Podemos in Spain. It's a left-wing populist. It's a populist. The M5 Star, I'm not even sure in Italy. I'm not even sure how it is classified left-wing, right-wing. It's definitely populist.
Okay.
Yeah. So now that we have this classification of different municipalities in terms of both support for populists and attitudes towards policies and ideological attitudes at the municipality level, then we relate to the geo-referenced rollout of 3G and 4G mobile phone signal coverage. So I'll show you the data, but basically we have the cloud as we used in the African context of the rollout
Can I
of
ask a
mobile
quick
phone
question?
coverage. Sure.
So just for my clarification, so the political position is between what, 0 and 1?
We standardize it to 0 and 1, yeah.
I see. And is it, you may have already covered this, so sorry, but is it across the five, ideologies that you have mentioned, or is it just that you first, identify a party as populist and then do the way?
No. Sorry. I should also have clarified this. This is truly irrespective of being populist or not. So each party, I think, well, each party is a big claim. I think it's like in the order of 300 parties, European parties, I should say. The CHS is only for Europe. These guys classify 300 major parties. So there are typically parties that got 0.1%. Typically, we don't have them in the CHS. We are unable to characterize them. And so we just put them in other parties. But yeah, no, it's true both for populist and non-populist parties. They are all given a position on these five dimensions, or even more dimensions. But these are the ones that we found most interesting.
I see.
Andre, sorry, can I have just one more question?
Sure.
So here you kind of define the populism by party. And then so I can imagine when the environment start to change because of the internet or the mobile internet, I can imagine some candidates among those parties who are considered as non-populist or more traditional parties might actually leaning towards, the populist to get more votes. So is it possible that, actually the populism is rising among all the candidates, even though some candidates are, they are associated with a party that's not considered as the populist party?
Yeah, so two answers to this. So first, one thing I should clarify is that these attitudes, party-specific attitudes, are actually party election specific. So a party might evolve over time in its attitude towards immigration. We calculate the average over the period. So we shut down the endogenous response of the party changing position. Just take the average. And what we do is to basically all the variation is coming from changes in the vote share for a party across elections. Going to the specific candidate, I agree in principle. To the extent that you as a candidate are not too divergent from the party politics, otherwise you would be expelled. But I agree that there might be heterogeneities across parties within the same, across candidates within the same party. But unfortunately, we don't have this information. So the most granular information we can have is at the party level. Candidates would be in the thought. So there's no classification at the candidate level. So it's a conceptually fair point, but it's impossible for us to explore.
Got it. Thank you.
So just on your first point there, you calculate the average for a party over those 11 years?
Correct.
Why would you do that though? Because the changes are presumably really interesting over time as well. And I think what Simon suggested, at least as anecdotal evidence, that sort of conventional parties have moved marginally to the left, for example, on migration. I think in Germany, in Denmark, there's evidence of that over time, the parties that previously might not have been populist, but they've been incorporating sort of populist values, if there's such a thing, in their policy. So I think that's really interesting variation. If you take the average over that time frame, don't you get rid of a lot of variation that's interesting?
Okay, so on the populist label, this is time invariant. These guys just tell me it's Northern League is populist, tout court, throughout the period. These other ones are election year specific, and I agree. It's kind of a sort of an accidental historical accident in the construction of this massive data set for us. So at some point we just took the average and we kept that. We could go back to the raw data and just expand. I agree that the endogenous I agree that the time-varying component of ideology is interesting per se. The advantage of taking the time invariant on ideology, besides the fact that, I mean, just frankly, it's the result of this historical accident for us in the construction. But if I want to kind of find a rationale for this, is that then the results are conflating two things. From a municipality perspective, when we have this weighted average of the position of the municipalities, conflating two things: the change in the voting shares that parties receive and the change in the political positions of the party. By keeping time invariant the position of the party, the only thing that is, we know what is changing is the vote shares received by parties that are such and such.
Yeah, but
I
the
agree
definition
that
changes. So, I mean, if I think about, I'm from Germany. If I think about who I would have voted for 10 years ago and who I'd vote for now, it's very different. In part, it's of course how I've changed maybe my attitudes, but I think in part it's also what the parties stand for. So I guess one.
You mean the same party? So that the same party has evolved over time and has
Yes,
changed
very much
its
so.
position.
Yeah. I think Greens are a good example. Again, in Germany over the 90s, they started out being this idealistic group, and then at some point they came in government, and it changed to becoming very pragmatic quite quickly. And there's a bunch of those examples. So I guess one, couldn't you do what you're doing now, where you fix the average and then let it vary and see the difference in coefficients you get? Wouldn't that allow you to to delineate the two mechanisms you're suggesting? Sort of the supply side and demand side in some ways. And the other point is, if you take one time invariant value, wouldn't it be better to take the initial one as opposed to the average over time? Because in the average over time, you build in that endogenous change.
You still have the endogeneity.
Yeah. Why don't you, in at least an alternative specification, if you can do it, take the 2007 values and run with them, and see if there are not many differences across those estimates you get, then there you go. So then you
but I agree there is something to be learned in both cases. So if nothing is really changing, then most of the variation is taken care of by the change in the voting shares. But if there are differences between the two, then, and I think that's the important point you were making here, maybe there is something to be learned about the supply side and not so much about the demand side as well. So also the change that is induced by these guys endogenously changing their position. So I think it's a good point. So I'll take that into account. For today's presentation, it's, as I was saying, time invariant and just both shares changes.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And so we complement these two sets of data with a large array of baseline municipal characteristics and regional characteristics that I'll describe. So this is for the municipal level data for our political outcomes. When it comes to attitudes, what we use is the European Value Study and the World Value Survey that combined make the so-called integrated value survey, I think. There are many pros to this individual level data. There are about 70,000 respondents that cover all countries in our sample. And the beauty of this data is that it reports voting intentions of these respondents. So we know whether they plan to vote for a populist party or not, for a party that is very right-wing and so on and so forth. But we also know the respondent attitude towards in dimensions that are very similar to the ones that we use to characterize parties. So we know the voters' attitudes, the respondents' attitudes towards immigration, EU enlargement, economic issues, but then even more so, the survey also asks questions about more general attitudes about this in-group versus out-group distinction on matters that are not necessarily at the center stage of the political debate. So it's not really about policy issues, but really about ideological issues. We also have a rich set of individual characteristics. The downside of this data is that these guys are identified at a coarser level of geographical variation. So I don't know the municipality these guys live in, but only their region. So what is called NUTS2. So it would be North Westphalia, Piedmont, Andalusia. So these big macro regions. That's the variation I'm using. when it comes to the individual level beliefs and attitudes. Finally, in terms of individual level data, we also collected the birthplace of over 300 top telecommunication managers in Europe that we use in our IV analysis that I'll discuss in a few slides. Okay, so just descriptively before jumping to the analysis. So I told you that we want to kind of add content to these labels of populism, what they are. And so we're just presenting here party level correlations between populism and the CHES variables on these dimensions of policy and ideology. And so what we see is that, well, the two populist measures are highly correlated with each other. So these guys do a fair job in capturing which parties are populist. But more importantly, you see that in the European, well, these are things that are probably obvious and well known, but in the European context, populist parties are mostly right-wing. So compared to a traditional regular party, they are more likely to oppose immigration and EU integration. I shall say that all these variables from the CHES, we standardize them so that higher values mean more right-wing, more closed societies, more anti-immigration, more traditionalist, and so on. So even from a pure left-right ideological scale, parties that are classified as populist are between 31 and 40 percentage points more likely to be classified as populist for a 1 standard deviation increase in opposition to immigration, a 1 standard deviation increase on the left-right scale, you become between 18 and 30 percentage points more likely to be classified as populist, and so on and so forth. One perhaps less well-known thing, which I think is interesting, because it's consistent with this idea that the relevant political cleavages have changed over time, is that in terms of economic ideology, populist parties are no different from traditional parties. They are not more likely to advocate some particular economic policy, such as hybrid distribution. If anything, there is no correlation whatsoever, okay? And as we all probably know, they're also younger parties compared to traditional parties. In our sample, on average, 10 years younger compared to a traditional party. So this is just the party level correlations. If I take these variables, and again, just descriptively, I look at what has happened, no role for mobile internet so far, just what has happened in terms of decennial trends. And here I'm looking at average positions, and here I'm focusing on right-wing extremism. So average here meaning that it's both, for example, so first we look at populism, then policy positions in terms of opposition to immigration and EU integration, and then overall ideology, left-right on social matters and on economic matters. And average position here in the context of populism means any sort of populism, right and left wing. And so what we see is that over the decade, there is 14 to 16 percentage point increase in voting for populist parties. This is what has happened in Europe. When we split between right and left wing, we see that most of the action, especially according to Rudin, is coming from right-wing populist parties. These are the guys whose vote share has increased substantially between 2007 and 2017. When we look at policy positions and ideology, these again are, you should think of them as changes in the vote share from the first electoral year to the last electoral year. And if we compare right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism, and here I'm calling extremism because we're taking parties in the top decile of the ideological distribution on these different matters. So these are parties that are, among all parties, they're extremely anti-EU. And these guys are in the bottom decile of the ideological distribution. They are very pro-EU. These guys are extremely traditional, and these guys are extremely liberal when we look at Gallup. So all the shift, there's been an average shift to the right. And in particular, there's been a sensible increase in extremist right-wing parties. So parties that are very traditional have enjoyed a 5 percentage points increase over the decade. Those very much against immigration, 7 percentage points, whereas the effect is much more muted on the left, not so much action. So left-wing parties, extremist parties have not gained, they have not lost much, but the big winners of the past decade in Europe has been the extremist right-wing parties. So the question is then that we want to try and answer is, what's the role of access to social media and mobile internet in kind of this political and ideological shift? Now, these of course are just aggregate continental trends. Let me give you a sense of the granularity of our data. So let me start from 2006 and go up all the way to 2017. So, well, blue and green means very little populism. Orange and red, extremely high voting share for parties characterized as populist. So these are the countries that have voted in 2006, okay? And then as time goes by, you will see new countries enter as they go and vote. And you'll see that Europe turns more red, if you like. So if you just compare the first year where we have all countries having voted for the first time, which is 2010, and you compare with the last year in the sample, which is 2017, I mean, here Europe has turned red and very extremist. I shall say that this is the vote share received by extremist parties. So this is the vote share received by parties that are in the top decile, either on social issues or on policy issues, very against immigration, very against EU integration, and extremely traditional. We would observe basically very similar graphs if I were to focus on populist voting shares, right wing, and so it doesn't make much of a difference. The main point is there. It's consistent with the continental trends I showed you before. Europe has turned right in the past decade.
So,
the data.
Sorry,
go ahead, Simon.
can I interrupt here? So it seems to me like you are kind of suggesting those populists are just those extremists. No, right? They are not the same, but these examples that you have been given to us is seems to suggest or linking those populists with those extremists.
No, I think that so let me just finish a little bit on the data and I'll go back to your point in 1 second. So
okay,
I wanted to stress that on the data, I think, well, the data are just, again, since they've been so painstakingly collected, I really love them to heart, but I think they're really cool. So there are things that you can see. You can still see the divide between West and East Germany 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall in support for the AfD. You can see resistance to Rassemblement National in the island of Corsica. You can see the split between the Flemish and the French part of Belgium. Greater support for the Northern League in the north of Italy, and whatever is happening in the south of Portugal. So there is a lot of granularity in the data. Plenty of variation over time, across countries, but even within countries, okay? So I'm not sure you can see these boundaries here, but these are basically the NUTS2 regions that have been used in previous analysis. And there is as much as 15 percentage point divide in support for populist parties within NUTS2 regions, between the bottom decile and the top decile within a region. So plenty of variation that has been unexplored. Now, going back to Simon's question, I don't want to mean that populist parties are right-wing necessarily everywhere. There have been plenty of left-wing parties, populist, some of them successful. So take Podemos in Spain or the M5 Star movement, Syriza in Greece, there certainly have been. But in Europe, by and large, I'm not talking here on the supply side. On the demand side, the winners have been right-wing populist parties, and that's why I want to move away even from the populist thing. So as I was answering before, on columns 3 to 7, there's the voting share of parties that are very extreme in their ideology. They're not necessarily populist. It's not conditional on being a populist. So in here you have voting share increase for extremist party, both populist and non-populist. So if you like, I would even like to move away from to this classification. I use it because it's been widely used, but as I was saying before, it's a label. So I rather like to characterize what has happened on policy positions and ideology. And what we see in these columns is that Europe had turned right, and to the extreme right, in terms of social issues, in terms of support for policy positions that support closed societies. So anti-immigration and anti-EU, not necessarily populist.
Sorry, Simon, you go.
Okay, so I just want quick follow-ups before Michael. So can you help me here? So if I want to make a distinction between a right-wing populist party and a right-wing extreme party, what's the main distinction?
That's a good point. And to some extent, I'm unable to tell you because the populist label, I'm just borrowing from this Rudin and Norris. So whatever they say it's populist, I take it at face value. So if they tell me that Northern League is populist, I take it as face value.
Okay.
And I showed you before, there is a correlation between being a populist and being extremely anti-immigration. So this is what I was showing, what I was showing here. So this is the extent to which being a populist also, I can tell you that being a populist doesn't mean anything on economic terms. Being a populist means you're younger. Being a populist means you're more right-wing. It means you're more traditional and so on. But again, for being extremely traditional is not a necessary condition to be a populist.
Okay.
You can be, so here I'm just documenting this support, just what I'm showing here. What I'm showing here is the increase in voting share for parties that are extremist on these matters. And in here, there will be parties that are both populist and non-populist.
Right.
So I want to move away from the populist label. Actually, in the title, we talk of this political tribalism, trying to stress the in-group versus out-group, the closed societies as opposed to the open societies, the communitarian as opposed to the universalist, not so much about the populist.
Yeah, and it could be just a growing extremism because of that. Yeah.
Correct. That's the way I like to think about it. That as it turns out, these parties have been classified as populist many times, not always, but it's too much of a loose label. And so we rather look kind of the core content, which is that there's been an increase in support for policies that go to closed societies.
Right.
And ideologies that are more traditional, conservative, and so on.
Right. All right. Sorry, Michael.
Sorry, I know you're not even at your main data yet, so we can move this to later. But like saying that Europe has moved to the right, I'm not sure that's correct. What you identify is here these parties on the right wing. But what also happened with many traditional parties in Europe is that they, within themselves, moved further and further to the left. So, for example, the conservative party in Germany 10, 15 years ago was very skeptical towards the EU, not sort of against it, but very sort of, we need to retain our own independence. And with Merkel, they have moved more and more, what many people would say, to the left. So that party itself looks very different than it looked 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's much more to the left on many issues. Now, you don't capture that here because you define that party the same way throughout, but it has changed a lot. So that means the ones that were voting for that party, that were sort of on the right front of that party, they don't have that party anymore because the party shifted to the left. So they might still vote their same preferences as before, but now it's just under a different label that's explicitly this AfD party in Germany. So to say that on average, it's moved to the right. I'm not sure. You may be correct, but it may not be, because the traditional parties in themselves have changed and they've moved leftwards.
Okay. So I guess it goes back to your previous point, which I share and I agree about the change in the party positions. I must say two things on this. First, my just very superficial recollection of looking at the data is that this variation might be less than what you think, at least in the CHES. I wouldn't expect these experts to have widely changed their assessment of parties. Second, I'm not sure that all parties, I understand that that happens to me. I have a strong focus on Italy when I think of politics. And I try to kind of extrapolate. I'm not sure that what has happened to the CDU is true for all major parties in Europe. And so we can say that there is a shift to the left of major parties in their positions that would counter, but I simply don't know. So at this point, it's just I buy your previous point. So I need to look at the. But Michael, let me move on because I will never make.
I guess my point is just I wouldn't phrase it that strongly, because I don't think anything what you do afterwards builds on that. So I would just be carefully navigating that, because some political scientists might take.
Okay. Okay. No, that's a fair point. Thanks.
Would you have time for one more short question?
Sure.
So related to Michael's point, what I was thinking was the vote share will be an outcome. It's a second order outcome, because it depends on how many political parties are you competing against. So there's a competition element, and there's also a demand element, that how many people in that particular community or municipality are of a particular point of view, right? And what we see here is an outcome of those two forces, the interplay of those two forces, right? So I was wondering if you could say perhaps do the same graph in terms of how many parties were there from a particular ideological part of the spectrum. So instead of the vote share, like were there more populist parties overall in these regions? And the reason why I say that both have value, right? So with an increasing demand in populist ideological stance, you will have more political parties that will cater to that particular stand or particular demand. What do you think about that?
Sorry, I'm not sure. I guess it depends a little bit, and it goes beyond my expertise. But I guess it goes a little bit on the IO of the political supply side. I'm not sure that necessarily you want to have a more fragmented populist political spectrum as demand increases. You might have very high fixed costs to build up a party, and then there's only one populist party that has an incumbent advantage, and so it capitalizes on this increasing demand.
Yeah.
But I can think about it. So on the number of parties rather than the vote shares. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, guys. So on the diffusion of mobile internet, on the other hand, okay. So we now see the change in voting shares. So just descriptively, 3G coverage in Europe starts at 45% already in 2006, and it reaches universal coverage around 2012. Whereas 4G starts in 2013, and by the end of our sample period, 40% of the European population is covered by 4G. Now, this is kind of important because when you think of our treated guys, the guys who are treated by the intervention, by the rollout of the internet, is a selected sample of the European population, because by 2006, which is when 3G arrives, the investment is so massive that there are people who, big cities typically, or so more, densely populated, richer areas, are covered since the very beginning. So throughout the period, they're always covered. They're not treated by this staggered introduction. So effectively, our treatment sample is those 200 million Europeans who receive internet at different points in time. Okay, so I want to be clear that a good, say, 60% of the population has internet to begin with. So it's never treated. It's not that some period they don't have internet, then internet arrives. Okay, is this remaining 40% of the European population, 200 million people, who receive internet at different points in time. These are our treated individuals. And that might even be important to think of our results. So just a dynamic map of coverage, just to show you the cloud. In blue, you have 3G coverage, and in orange, at some point, 4G coverage will arrive. So effectively, there are areas of Spain which are very scarcely at low density of population who are not covered to this day. But as I was saying, by the end of the sample period, there is universal coverage when you weight by population in terms of 3G, and 40% of the population is covered even by 4G. So moving on and going to the analysis, we combine this data to then look at some electoral outcome in a given municipality M of a given country C in electoral year T. So the electoral outcome of this municipality is a function of how much mobile coverage the municipality has in that election year. Now, we just assume that the population in a municipality is uniformly distributed. So we have the polygons of the municipality. We know how much of the polygon is covered by the cloud of 3G or 4G coverage. So if 60% of the municipality is covered, we say that 60% of the population in the municipality is in reach of the mobile phone signal in that year. We control for baseline characteristics of the municipalities, so population, GDP, unemployment rate, so on and so forth. These are baseline characteristics that we interact with time trends to allow municipalities that are different at baseline to follow different trends that might explain both how much coverage they receive and who they vote for. We also control for time invariant municipality characteristics. Rome will always get earlier coverage and vote differently than some mid-sized Italian city. And we allow different countries to be following different trends in terms of coverage and support for populism. All the regressions are weighted by population in order to get an estimate that is representative for the average European citizen over the period. And we, I would say, conservatively cluster the standard errors at the country level. Typically, this leads to inflated standard errors. So we like to play against ourselves and get as conservative of an estimate as possible. Now, even though we exploit this very fine-grained level of variation and these narrowly geographically defined areas, one might still be concerned that coverage doesn't happen at random, and there's a reason why this state is covered before the other one. And so we think that we come up with arguably plausibly exogenous variation in coverage by building on a corporate finance literature that tells us that CEOs, firms, managers enjoy personal rents for reasons in the terms of their pay, for reasons that go beyond their merits, say because of luck, because of good conjuncture, economic conjuncture, especially when things are going well for the firms and the sector. The idea in this corporate finance literature is that when things go well, shareholders pay less attention. And this creates room for slack on the side of the manager who enjoys personal benefits in terms of getting a higher salary, of setting a higher salary to himself. So in line with this argument, it is conceivable to think that managers might extract additional rents, not necessarily only in terms of pay, perhaps by exerting less effort when things are going well. This accrues to its utility, or just enjoying perks that go above and beyond their salary. And so we operationalize this idea by looking at whether telecommunication managers in Europe, when the telecommunication sector is doing well, they favor areas that are closer to their birthplace in terms of coverage. This either because directly yield utility to cover their family and friends, if they can, or because they know the environment and they need to exert less effort to to grease the wheels of bureaucracy. They know the key players there, and it's easier for them to cover areas they know well, as opposed to areas they know less well. And so, in practical terms, we instrument coverage at the municipality level by the distance of each municipality from the closest birthplace of a telecommunication manager in office. So if I'm a lucky municipality and I happen to be close to where that guy of Telecom Italia comes from, then maybe I'm going to get coverage earlier than an unlucky municipality that happens to be much farther away from the birthplace of this guy who has power to decide where coverage goes. And this, of course, is the distance from the birthplace of the guy interacted with a growth rate in the telecommunications sector, again, based on the corporate finance idea that managers have room for slack only when shareholders don't pay attention, which is when the sector is doing fine. Now, of course, distance from the birthplace of a telecom manager correlates with many other things. Say, telecom managers only come from the big cities, then being distant from a big city, it's a proxy for being remote, rural, and voting for a populist party. Nothing to do with the fact that you get less coverage because of our story. And so we want to control for the major socioeconomic and geographical characteristics of the municipalities. So you should think of this instrument as akin to a Bartik instrument, where, however, also the shares change over time because managers enter and exit from office. So the same municipality in some period will be close to the birthplace of a guy because I happen to be close to Naples and there is a telecom managers in 2007 that is from Naples. But then managers enter and exit over time. So the same municipality, well, not Naples, I mean, this guy's there forever, but in general, municipalities are lucky and unlucky over time. Now, this is just one portion of the variation. Another portion of the variation that is important is how fast the sector is growing. Okay, this creates the room for slack on the manager side. And so before moving to the parametric first stage estimates, let me give you a sense of the power of the instrument, which tells us that if our story is true, then distance should really matter when the sector is growing and the managers want to exert their power. So on the solid line here, we have the continental growth in mobile phone coverage. So coverage grows very quick in the early years. Then there is almost universal coverage and the additional room for coverage is little and managers have no role whatsoever any longer in kind of favoring their birthplace. So initially grows at 40%, then it stays around 10% up until 2010, and then the rollout is completed. On the short dashed line here, we have the estimated marginal effect year by year of distance on the probability of a municipality being covered. And here you have the coefficients. And as you can see, as the sector is growing fast in the early years, being farther away from the birthplace of a telecom manager in office is highly prejudicial for how covered you will be. You will be much less covered than a municipality that is close to the birthplace. And the thing remains true up until the coverage is growing fast. But then the effect of distance on coverage goes to zero as the effect is completed. And the more yes,
Andrea, sorry, can I have a quick question here? So your instrument is an interaction of two variables. One is distance, one is this growth rate of coverage. These two variables have the same sign in terms of the correlation with the coverage, or they are in opposite sign? So distance is negatively correlated with coverage, and the growth rate is positively correlated with coverage? Or
correct. Distance per se is negatively correlated, I would say. And overall coverage, well.
And the growth rate will be positive or negative correlated with the coverage?
So the growth rate is at the country level.
Yes.
And its coverage at the municipality level. So I would say overall it's positively correlated.
So they are in the opposite.
It exacerbates the effect, the growth rate.
So the growth rate is going to amplify the effect. Effectively, this is what you have in this table. So you have distance and distance times coverage. The coverage at the country level itself is absorbed by the country by year trend. So what you're getting here effectively is the coefficient, how distance matters when the sector is not growing, when this term is dead. So growth rate of coverage at the country level is 0, which is when effectively you've completed the rollout, and distance it doesn't matter at that point. But instead, as coverage is growing quicker, then distance matters more, and you have this negative and significant effect. The farther you are, as the country is growing quick in its coverage, the less coverage you, from a municipality perspective, will receive. All the countries is getting it, but you, as you're far away from the manager, you're getting less than a closer municipality. It's not an absolute statement. It's not that you're getting less in absolute terms. You're getting less than a municipality that is close to this guy.
Yeah, I ask because, we have this one experience that is a referee comments. I understand why you need to have this growth rate, because you need a time type variation, because the distance doesn't have that. So we have a similar experience, but in this one comments we have is that if you have two variables that move in opposite directions in terms of the correlation with the endogenous variable, then how should we interpret the compound instrument? If the two single variables, they move in opposite directions, then what do we expect in terms of the relationship between this, constructed instrument with the endogenous variable?
I don't know, Simon, to me here, it's kind of natural in terms of the interpretation. I think it doesn't, so there's not much mystery. It's kind of, I don't know in your case, but in this case, it's kind of hinged upon, at least conceptually, on this literature that tells us what the science should be. So distance should matter, and it should matter more when these guys don't pay attention. So it should be negative and should be more negative when things are well.
Okay.
Anyway, guys, I have 15 minutes, so let me. So with this predicted coverage, we finally go to the results, and I will never be able to make it, and I'm sorry for that. So. Municipal level, so administrative, the voting level results. Populism, policy positions, ideology. Okay, so measures of populism, position on immigration and EU, ideology, traditional, libertarian. And let me start with the average effects of having more coverage on these dimensions. So what we see is that there are very economically and statistically meaningful effects. So there are two thought experiments possible here. A municipality, as it moves from 0 to 100% coverage, displays between 13 and 24 percentage points increase in the populist vote. That's what we have here. These variables are in terms of standard deviation instead. And what we see is that we move from 0 to 100% coverage. There is between 0.4 and 1.1 standard deviation increase in measures of closed as opposed to open society. First thought experiment, you move from 0 to 100. Now, as we saw before, the percentage point increased over the decade in populist party support, and we saw that the percentage points increase in coverage in the continent between 2007 and 17 has been of 40 percentage points. Then our estimates based on these coefficients tells us that the continent-wide growth in mobile coverage can explain about 50% of the increase in populist vote overall. Now, what about what this literature is telling us? That these guys should become more concerned and more tribal and more in support of closed societies when they feel threatened. And so here we use unemployment rate, which has the beauty of being time varying, so allows us to control for potentially different trends in unemployment per se, and is available for all countries. We find very similar results if we use other measures of economic grievance, such as income inequality, share of low educated individuals, poverty, and so on. These measures are only available at baseline, so they're more kind of less precisely measured, but basically the message is the same, is that the effect of mobile internet in support for closed societies is amplified as unemployment grows bigger in those areas where unemployment is higher. So a 1 standard deviation increase in the unemployment rate brings an additional 6 to 8 percentage points increase in populist vote as coverage goes from 0 to 100, an additional 0.1 to 0.3 of a standard deviation in support for closed societies, becoming even more anti-immigration, becoming more socially conservative, being more against individual freedoms, and so on. Now, just on the side, since we're very short on time, I would like to point out that in this very saturated model of ours, there is no effect of unemployment per se in support for populism and closed societies, which instead there is a big literature that claims that unemployment has played a role, and we don't find that in once you account for municipal time invariant characteristics and so on. So these are average effects on ideologies and policy positions. What about the extremism I showed you before, the top and bottom decile? We showed that right-wing extremists that gained support descriptively was the role of mobile internet in this rise in support. So just one last thing. In the interaction model here, coverage and unemployment are standardized at the mean. So this is capturing the effect of coverage at average unemployment. This is the effect of unemployment at average coverage. And so as a result, you can see that the main effect we can still recover from the interaction model. You can see it hardly changes, okay? So from now on, I move to the interaction model that allows me to recover both the main effect of coverage and the amplification. And what we see is that there's the same pattern, but less precisely identified, of coverage per se in support for extremist right-wing parties. And there is a very clear same gradient in the amplification that comes from economic and social grievances. So in areas that are characterized by high unemployment, as coverage is rolled out, the support for parties that are extremely socially conservative, extremely right-wing, and so on and so forth, increases big time. On the other hand, we find nothing on left-wing extremism. I want to point out that we don't find an increase in support nor a decrease in support, right? So mobile internet in the context of Europe, with our specification, had no impact on the voting shares of extremely liberal parties. And so overall, this is consistent. The average shift and the increase in extremist vote is consistent with a shift that has moved from moderate to extreme right-wing positions. It's not that mobile internet has reshuffled votes from the left to the extreme right. Perhaps, as we would expect, the reshuffling has happened between moderate to extreme right-wing positions as a function of availability of mobile phone coverage. So, in the last 7 minutes, let me just summarize here what we've done so far and move to the opinions. We observed that a substantial fraction of the increase in support for populist parties can be attributed to the mobile internet, and that this effect is amplified in areas at greater economic disadvantage. These parties that are called populist are characterized by strong anti-universalist values. Now, the key open questions are, if our story is true, that this rising support for populism is a rising support for closed societies, and it responds to an increased demand and an ideological shift for such policies and ideologies, then there are at least two things I need to show you. First, the dimensions of closed as opposed to open society matters for voters when they decide who to vote, right? This could be just accessories. It could be that I vote for these parties because they have a strong leader, and they also happen to be close proponents of closed societies, but closed societies doesn't really matter. I want to argue that this is a salient aspect of who I decide to vote. And second, even if I show you that this is a salient aspect of who I decide to vote, is access to mobile internet responsible for a change in these ideological positions? And so to investigate these questions, we go to the microdata. So the first thing I want to show you is that there is remarkable similarity between the admin and the individual level data in terms of voting intentions as a function of access to mobile internet and economic grievances. So here is now it's individual level data, guys who respond that want to vote for a populist parties, for a right-wing or a left-wing populist party. We observe the same pattern as before. This becomes more likely for respondents who live in areas characterized by economic grievances as mobile internet is rolled out. They are more likely to vote for a populist, and particularly for a right-wing populist. Now, are these dimensions of closed societies salient when it comes to decide who to vote? And here we're presenting something more than correlations, but not much more than correlations. So this is including region by year fixed effects and individual characteristics. These are questions asked to these guys. So this is their self-reported voting intention. And here the explanatory variables are the respondents' opinions that either closely map the policy positions from the CHS, or questions about, do you feel, so what's your, how do you identify yourself? And you can identify as a member of your neighborhood, of your city, of your country, continent, or the entire world. How intolerant you are towards minorities. So do you dislike having as a neighbor as a gypsy or a people of different race or homosexuals and so on and so forth. And you can see that these individual kind of ideologies are highly predictive of who you vote for. So you're much more likely to vote for a populist, and especially a right-wing populist, if you identify as very nationalist, if you identify with the local community, if you are intolerant towards minorities. So this seems to be predictive of who you decide to vote. And the last question is, did mobile internet change these attitudes toward gypsies, minorities, feeling local instead of global, being opposed to immigration and EU enlargement, which of course are very salient predictors of who you're gonna vote for? And this is what we observe in the last table here, where I'm basically repeating the previous administrative level regressions, but now the outcomes are at the individual level, and it's the respondent position on immigration and EU enlargement, and the respondent's ideology in terms of how nationalist he is, how local he is, how much he dislikes minorities, and so on and so forth. And so the coefficients have less statistical power, but they still tell us a very coherent story. And some of them are highly statistically and economically significant in telling us that as coverage of 3G and 4G arrives, individuals become more opposed to immigration. They become more opposed to the enlargement towards the east of the European Union. They become much more likely to identify as members of their nation, that it's important to have ancestors from the nation, all these sort of nationalist related questions. They are much more likely to identify with the local community as opposed to being universalists. They are more intolerant of minorities and so on. So if you take it, if you're willing to do this heroic assumption that we can interpret causally the previous correlations, so if we combine these correlations with the estimates from this table in the spirit of a mediation analysis, then we can tell that the changes in demand for a closed society, so this change in values induced by mobile internet, can explain between 15 and 25% of the overall voting intentions for right-wing populist parties. So mobile internet has contributed, we say, around 50% of the overall increase in right-wing populist parties in Europe, and between 15 and 25% is possible to be attributed to the role that mobile internet has had in making individuals change their mind and transition towards a vision of society that is one of a closed society as opposed to an open society. So taking stock, I already did that. If I have 1 minute, I would like to discuss alternative theories for our results. Do I have 1 minute? Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think it's important for us to distinguish from other relevant contribution in the literature. There's a lively debate about the role of political polarization in the US, the fact that Republicans have become more Republicans and them more them, and the role of social media, if any, in this shift, in this increasing polarization. So Kat Sunstein has famously argued that by provoking echo chambers, individuals have self-segregated, and left people kept talking to left people, right-wing people to right-wing, and they became polarized. Now, this angle of the social media, the self-segregation into groups of like-minded people, is unlikely to explain the patterns in our data. We do not observe an effect on both tails due to access to mobile internet. We only observe an effect on the right-wing tail. So if polarization and self-segregation on social media was at play, we would also observe a fattening of the left tail. So also extremist left-wing parties should have benefited, which we don't observe. Another thing that I would like to discuss, so rather than looking at this feature of social media, that is the self-segregation into echo chambers, we stress another one, which is the fact that you are overexposed to divisive content that is typically targeted towards minorities and outgroup members. And this we show, or we argue, has percolated through a change in the mindset of internet users that have increased demands for closed societies. Another slightly different story is the one about the role of unemployment per se as a driver of the populist vote. So there is an influential literature that argues that the rising support for populist parties in Europe, at least, has been the result of the economic crisis, the 2009 economic crisis. We think of our results as, rather than capturing concurrent shocks in unemployment, as effectively capturing long-term economic grievances. So as I was mentioning briefly before, we would get exactly the same results, and actually most of our results can be explained by the time invariant component of unemployment that reflect long-term deprivation rather, sorry, I need to sneeze, rather than concurrent shocks. So we see as our results as being different from those on the effect of unemployment per se, which, as I showed you before in the data, is effectively statistically insignificant and very close to zero per se. Finally, I'm stressing very much this demand side story. Internet has kind of influenced the mindset and increased demands for closed societies, and this has found a way in politics through these extremist right-wing parties. But there's an equally interesting supply side story, and that's why I was very interested in Michael's comment before, because I never thought in terms of kind of trying and learn something on the supply side by looking at the change in the party manifestos over time. The way we're thinking about it, so another story, the supply side story that we have in mind, is simply that mobile internet has given new parties a platform to spread their voice. And so these new parties have become particularly effective in spreading their message. And so we observe greater support in areas with internet, not because of a change in mindset, but simply because a message from these new parties could go through. And of course, it went through, especially in areas with greater coverage. So it's coming from the supply side. It's from the political message to the public that then vote. And so what we have in mind is, and we're working on it. It's not conclusive, but it's, I think, what we're trying to do is to first document that party by party how internet savvy a party is, and we want to document that indeed it might well be the case that new parties and populist parties tend to be new are indeed more internet savvy. So what we're doing is taking all candidates for each party and look at when they went on Twitter for the first time and how active they are on Twitter. So it might well be the case that these guys, newer parties, are more active. I would expect so. And yet, what we plan to document is that being new per se is not sufficient to benefit from mobile internet. So if I run the same administrative regressions before, but instead of having populist or extreme right-wing parties, I have new parties finding no effects. That's what I expect. And this would point to the fact that you might be new, you might be very internet savvy. Being new is not sufficient to enjoy the internet. You need to carry a very conservative, closed society set of values to enjoy the internet and benefit from the introduction of the internet, especially in areas characterized by long-term economic reasons. And so I close here with 8 minutes late. I'm super sorry, I didn't realize. And well, thank you so much for all the questions, for the feedback, and for staying so long into your afternoon.
Well, yeah, so I'll have to formally end the meeting, but Andrea, if you have a few minutes, some of us will have questions. And yeah, okay, totally. All right, good. So yeah, for those who have to leave and go back to children, their families, thank you for attending. And thank you, Andrea. This was fascinating. This is the kind of data work that gets you excited about research. So thank you. And I'll stop the recording now so that we can have a conversation off the record.